Michael and I pick up our conversation from last month, focusing on what he feels were the roots of control, the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten and his followers, whom Michael calls the Atenus. The conversation covers much ground, including the need to honor the cycles of life, in particular, the season of destruction. In our last conversation, we covered an awful lot of ground about the architects of control and how it was even working its way through in covering up the traces of history and culture of the ancient, very refined Irish civilization. But we left it off at Akhenaten and Nefertiti, which is really a big place in the story that you're presenting. You're saying Akhenaten may have actually been a very negative influence on cultures through to this day. And I think I mentioned at that point, too, that you're saying that there's evidence that his wife Nefertiti actually has European features.
Yeah, Western ancestry.
Western features, and that their daughter, Scota, moved to Ireland and ended her life there.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pick up the Akhenaten story. What's the problem with Akhenaten?
Well, I'm one of, I think, as far as I've been able to count, two authors that take a negative, view of this, lionized man. And I think when you review his life, his profile, and his theology, and what he also did to Egypt just physically, I don't think there can be any doubt that the man was a raving lunatic, like a psychopath. And I don't forget that in my work, I'm dating the architects of control from him. So, of course, since they've commissioned the history, and he's their big chief, of course they're going to, not see that, and they're going to lionize him and make him look in a good light, which is what's happened. He's the Christ before the Christ. He's the great healer, the great revolutionary, the great, reformer, the great sun king, and all of this kind of concept. And many monarchs and potentates are really basing themselves on the pharaohs in general, and on Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, particularly. But the fascinating thing is that once you again bend that rule, when you maybe flip it around, do a bit of a Columbo here and say, well, maybe if we look at it this way, and you turn that fact around, suddenly a whole other reality opens, which I think explains the world better. And part of that is his ancestry, his wife, his daughters. He had 6 daughters, one of whom is supremely important in Irish mythology and Scottish, since the word Scotland actually bears her name, heavy-duty stuff there. But once you get around the idea that he wasn't, totally together person, mentally, then you start getting into interesting concepts about what solar worship is. Why do these people refer to themselves as the princes of light? What is light? Does light have some negative properties we don't understand? Is there a theology there, connecting to the worship of light? And is Judeo-Christianity perhaps based on that, or all the religions today,
and you say
solar
these are
religions?
basically Atenist, based
I
on
use the word
Atenist.
Atenist
Yes.
because the god that Akhenaten worshipped was called Aten or Aton. Many letters, transliterated down through time, variants, changes, and if you change the D to a T, you have Adon, the Adonai. Which Adon was a Phoenician god, Adonai was a Judaic god, even if I use the word Judaic in parentheses there, and that's no different, as any Jew knows, but we may not reveal, may not be too happy to accept. Adonai is Jehovah. So the Jehovah of the Bible is the Adon, is the Aton, is the Adonai, is Odin.
Okay, from
right?
Norse
the
mythology.
Norse,
Yeah.
remember the West-East
Yes,
thing again?
yes.
So this is a universal God, except that some people would argue, and rightly so, that Yahweh, Jehovah, is a sort of a composite deity. They're right, because they all were. Many gods of the world were actually composite gods, brought
Right.
together by the merging of different groups.
Right.
And different cults and different races.
So we're going back to the women in Akhenaten's life. We're looking at replacing the religion of the day, which was based on the worship of Amun. Was that religion very similar to the Druidic in that it was based around the feminine principle and the goddess?
The Amonist and the Druidic connection, in my eyes, is identical.
Okay.
And if there's differences, it's, as far as I can see, it's cosmetic. They not only had a perfectly balanced, and that's not to say that they didn't have reprehensible aspects of their theology. I'm not promoting them.
Right.
I'm just
You're
pointing
just
it out.
talking about similarities.
Yeah. I'm not an Amonist. I'm not trying to say they're better than the Atenist or whatever. I'm just trying to define that they were these two different groups and they had great differences. But the beautiful thing about the Amonist system was it was tripartite. You know, it wasn't just a polarity of masculine and feminine. They even had a third principle. You know, just like you have Osiris, Horus, and
Right.
and Isis.
Right.
As soon as you see the triad principle, you know you're talking Druidism. Right from that point on, because the Druids are the well-known people who worship the three and the triangle, and they had their own trinity. You know you're talking the Arya of northern India because they had their Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. That Trimurti, that concept is all over the ancient solar cults and stellar cults of the world. That's just one small anecdote. But I do believe their ideology, their pantheon, their cosmology was much more balanced than what the Atnists came up with.
So the Atnists came up with a solo worship of what is perceived as the male aspect, as the sun.
Absolutely.
And so this became monotheism.
Absolutely.
And as a result, it wiped out, and it was intended to wipe out any of the earth, essentially what is the word I'm looking for when you're talking about the more balanced natural
the matriarchal
order of the religions of the day?
Sure.
So it was intended specifically to wipe that out.
Aggressively so. In fact, all monotheism, as many people like Leonard Schlein have pointed out, is aggressive from point go. It is exclusionary, not inclusive. You see, in the period before the Atnists rose, every other culture, Phoenician, Semitic, Cretan, Grecian, Hyksos, whatever, all of these people basically lived together in harmony. They could worship in harmony, and they saw commonality between their various gods. In fact, many gods are the same god under different names. Mm-hmm. When the Atnists come along and they make this absolutely, they were henotheistic, in the sense that they picked one god from many, because Aton did, as a god, predate Akhenaten. He was worshipped by Akhenaten's forefathers.
Right.
Tuthmosis, I think one of them was a Atnist and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were there. But he selected this god of light and lionized him more and promoted this. And by doing that was very aggressively exclusionary. And this included the feminine aspects, the matriarchal cults also.
And at the same time, that period, that 18th dynasty, was known for perpetuating artwork for the first time even, where the mother, the father, and the children are all depicted together, but under the rays of the sun.
But that's bogus, exactly. This is a propaganda, you see. And don't forget, it was only his family.
Yeah.
The chief Atnists.
Yeah.
Again, it was an exclusionary thing. But see, Akhenaten went so far as to prevent Kia, his second wife, from even using her full name, which was an Amonist name. Mm-hmm. And it meant the vulture goddess, which was, again, the old pantheons. She could only, he wouldn't allow that. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think he only gave her the permission, finally. And that was because, he just had to. She was the only one who was able to bend the rule at all to be able to use some of her titles that, were previously from Amonist basis, Everybody else was absolutely no way, no deal. I mean, he was very strict. They went to bed as soon as the sun set. They were pathologically afraid of the dark. They cancelled the Osirian cycle of the underworld, which psychologically, if Freud was sitting here, go, well, we have problems there, for sure. Right?
Yeah.
You're negating the dark side right away. So don't you see when I would say that there's a psychopathy involved, I can back that up. I can back that up. If you are denying the underworld cycle, you're cancelling out the dark side, even the physical darkness. That is as good a definition of schizoid as I could possibly come up with. I mean, there's people locked up here, raving lunatics operate on that level. So this man was a pharaoh, but with megalomania, with a psychopathy. But he had the power, you see, to change Egypt and change ultimately the world, because, as we hope to get into, his descendants ended up back in Ireland, the ancient homeland, you see.
So, okay, let's say Nefertiti, they had their 6 daughters. Skoda makes her way back to Ireland, and you're saying that Nefertiti may have been also of what appears to be of Caucasian heritage as well.
I think she was a member of what is, to be specific about it, she was a Scythian, what's known as a Scythian.
And can you explain what that is?
Scythian technically is a Celt. One of their homelands was in Turkey, but they were known to be, the Irish annals clearly tell you that they were European, but because of these catastrophes, they were displaced. These groups were in all sorts of different places. There's a city called Scythopolis in Galilee, which is, purported to be a Scythian capital, So basically in Galilee they were settled. In Turkey they were. In Jordan they were. And all through Turkey and Europe and Anatolia, Cappadocia, these were their headquarters. The reason why we think, although I think I'm the only one who thinks she's Scythian, but as you say, the rumor was that she may have had Western people. Lorraine Evans and a few other scholars have sort of dabbled in that. Is it just the look of her face?
Yes, she does look very distinctly different than the other queens of that
That's
time.
right. And also no ancestry, no history.
Right.
It's like it's been suppressed or whatever. To me, it's a no-brainer because her daughter, her chief daughter, his nickname was Scotia. Scythians weren't called Scythians in Scythian times they were called the Scuts.
Scuts. Okay.
In their own era. They were also called Mesagete, they were also called Saga, or Shaka, which means stag, the stag men. Zaka, Staga, Saga, where we get the modern words sage. So they were the sages, they were the wise ones. So even then, they took a name that meant the wise ones. You're dealing with the wise ones here. They're descendants of the Arya, ultimately. Before they became Atnists, they were of basically the same gang of people. I'm talking about the Arya, the Druids, okay? Although they became, what I believe, corrupted. By the time they became Atnists in Egypt, they were goners.
Corrupted?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Scota's own nickname, she was really called Mary Tatan, which means the beautiful one of
yes.
Aton, right?
Yes.
We get the biblical word Mary from the Egyptian Meri, you know, and I think there's a connection to the plant myrrh, is where we get the word Mary. Ralph Ellis and others think it actually just means the beautiful one, and it's the origin of Mary in the Bible.
Yes.
So Meritaten's nickname is the name of the Scythian people, and her mother's Nefertiti, the beautiful one who has come, right, with her aquiline features that even Adolf Hitler said, I think she's Western, you know. It's pretty obvious, right? So these characters were Scythian, Egyptian, Akhenaten's own family. After the cataclysms, after the famine that happened in Egypt, after the displacement, or let's say expulsion of Akhenaten, they needed to leave. And they took refuge amongst a group called the Hyksos, who are also Scythian in my view. These Hyksos have now been 100% proven to be the same people as the Israelites. There is no doubt about it, and there can't be in the mind of any sane reader at all.
Which becomes interesting because there's some work by Lawrence Gardner, for example, who would say that Akhenaten and Moses are one and the same.
Yeah.
Some others would say, no, actually they were brothers, but they're putting them in the same ballpark in terms of
But he's not the
that
first.
migration.
Conor McDarry was already dealing with that at the turn of the century.
Yeah.
Then it was picked up very strongly in 1930 with Sigmund Freud, whose last book was Moses and Monotheism. Immanuel Velikovsky looked at it. Freud's colleague, Dr. Carl Abraham, very much believed. In fact, if you want to get into specifics, Abrahams believed they were the same,
Yes.
and Freud wouldn't go so far. He said, let's keep it open. You know, but he was in the circle. He was a priest in the circle of Akhenaten,
Right.
meaning Moses was a priest in the circle of Akhenaten.
Akhenaten.
But Abrahams had already gone, no, man, face it, they're one and the same
What
thing.
do you think?
They're one and the same thing.
Okay, Akhenaten and Moses are one and the same, so let's proceed with that.
Well, then this opens a whole ball of wax.
Yeah, lots of implications.
Well, the one thing that Freud always pointed to was the fact that Moses, meaning son of, is found in Tuthmosis,
Yes.
you know, Ra-Moses, Al-Moses. It's an Egyptian name. Ra-Moses means son of Ra,
Right.
right? So Moses is already an Egyptian name. The raising of the standard.
Tuthmosis the Fourth, by the way.
Right,
is Akhenaten.
Tuthmosis is
Yes.
Akhenaten's father.
That's right.
And no, Tuthmosis the Fourth.
He's the fourth.
Is
Akhenaten is Tuthmosis the Fourth, I believe.
right.
Or-
Amenhotep the Fourth.
Oh, Amenhotep
Maybe
the
I'm
Fourth.
wrong. I'll have
No,
to look
you're
this
right.
up.
Amenhotep the
Okay,
Fourth.
and his
You
father
got
was
it.
the
Yes.
Tuthmosis the Fourth. But there is that famous name.
Yes.
In fact, when you get into the Tuth, that's a big one right there, because the T's are really meant to be D's. T-U-T for Tut. This is where you get the word Teuton. We're back to the Western connection, the Tudors of
Yes.
England, right? Where does this word tutor? You know, a teacher is a tutor. Where do all these T-U-Ts come from that we find
Atlantean.
even in Egypt?
Atlantean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see, and that is really DVD. The D's, the sound of D can sound like T. When you put the D back, you have the D-U-D or the DVD, which is DVD is David, the Davids. So a Tuthmosis is really a David, a commander of Aton, a commander of Ammon, you know, a commander.
At this point, when Akhenaten has to leave Egypt, you're saying that's where, in the story, the Bible would pick up of Moses leading his people through these times, these very Spartan times in the desert.
Exactly. We don't exactly know what happened to Akhenaten himself. A great contingent of his people went to Tanis, which is up in the delta, to take refuge. And then the Bible story talking about the holy people leaving and being taken into captivities. We're talking about this era, the expulsion of the so-called Israelites from Egypt. It was a cover story, a fictional account. I've described the Bible as nothing more as the Chronicle of the Atnists, or a book of the Pharaohs, which it is if you really know what you're reading. And the most fascinating thing goes back to Skota herself. She ends up marrying a person that is of monumental importance in Irish legends, right? Which was King Mile, M-I-L-E, where we get the word militia from, you know. And he was a Scythian king. from a very prestigious line equal to the pharaohs. Maybe a little bit less, but certainly from a mystery school point of view, from an esoteric point of view, they were on the same rank as the pharaohs. These are Scythian Celts. The rumor is, or the annals are saying, that Miel and Scota and their whole gang, they are basically the same people as the Atenists. There's no difference between these people. They start migrating back to their ancestral homes. They don't just go off elsewhere. They make a sort of little journey. Now, in Western history, you will hear about these people. There are certain Celtic books on the Irish history that will pick up about the story of the Atenists, but they always only stop at Spain. Because when these people moved west and got to Spain...
What about Ralph Ellis's work?
Ralph Ellis is pretty much doing the same thing when it comes to the Scythians.
Okay.
Right. Unfortunately, there's a little glitch there. Plus, he's very weak on the Scythians. He has not been able to make the Hyksos-Scythian connection.
Okay.
For whatever reason. He talks about Cretans, he talks about they maybe have been connected with the Philistines. And this is he's not the only one. There seems to be some strange reason. Oh, I know what it is actually. It's because to do that opens up the whole west to east movement of the elements of civilization, which they won't touch.
All right, so let's go on then.
So, very important question though.
Yeah.
But the thing is that now you have this migration. As I said, Celtic scholars will tacitly admit, oh yeah, well we know about the Milesians and the potential of the Egyptian princess that came with them coming over from Spain. But they will rarely go further back than that, you see, unfortunately. But now we have the evidence, through the Ralph Ellises and Mustafa Gedellas and Ahmed Osmans, this coming to light. Previously, as I said, through Sigmund Freud and Commons Beaumont and what have you. And the incredible story is that her name meant Scythian. She was the woman who finally gave her name to Scotland. But before Ireland was called Scota, before Scotland was called Scota, or Scota, Ireland was the name. It's because the Irish went over to Scotland and brought their princess's name that Scotland took its name. Ireland was once called Scota. Scota's physical grave is in County Kerry. And Lorraine Evans will tell you in her book Kingdom of the Ark about all the other Egyptian artifacts that have been literally dug up and can't be explained. And she talks about Nefertiti. She's made the Nefertiti connection. She's made the connection to Akhenaten, So it's not Akhenaten himself, nor even, for that matter, Tutankhamun, or even Aya, right? Pharaoh Aya. We're not talking about them physically themselves coming out to the west, but their descendants. Yes. Certainly, Scota has the connections there. The Irish legends talk about it. The Scottish legends talk about it. You see, basically, it's a well-known anecdote in the ancient Celtic mythology, is the coming of the Egyptian princess.
So its effect was, by hooking up with...
Now we're full circle.
Yes.
Now we're full circle, because look at the dates. I believe that in Irish mythology, they know the story of the coming of what they call the Milesians after King Miel and his wife.
And I think I read in your book that King Miel was a little off-center.
His son was.
Oh, his son was off-center. Don. Okay.
Adonai. But Miel's son is called Don.
Okay.
And his other one, I mean, the names are amazing.
So, sorry, I got that one wrong. So
you know what his other son was called? Aaron.
Aaron, okay.
That's not biblical. Right, so when they arrive, then we notice a date. 500 BC. Rome has just risen, 700 BC. You can chart their movement, I believe, across, Ralph has done this, Ralph Ellis has done this to a certain extent, and you can take it yourself and see this incredible paradigm coming through Greece, Athens. You can see this movement.
But this is considerably later, because you're talking, Akhenaten was actually 1,300 years BC. Now we're talking 500 years BC.
Right, because this is a movement. There's a decision-making process. There's the moving to Spain. In between the move to Spain, they've already moved back to Scythia, Miel and Scota. And these people, or there's a movement here. How do you work out, how this could be done in this timeline? This is an interesting timeline.
Right.
And in the Irish Origins book, we go through that to show you how this figures, Right. It's hard to... in a few minutes to explain it.
So let's just, we'll go into the net effect of it.
The net effect is when the Milesians get to Ireland about 500 BC, you have you have a campaign of genocide again, where the matriarchal cults of Ireland, who are ancestral, these are the hardcore area, the very pure Druidic schools, start to be slowly annihilated. And that process of cannibalization and colonization takes about 1,000 years. Which then, of course, will do what? That will bring us up past the era of Christianity.
500 AD?
Yeah. So the rise of Christianity is commensurate, not just with the rise of the Templars in the 13th century and all of that, but the rise of Christianity about 300 AD is commensurate with the takeover of Ireland and Britain by these Milesians. The Atenists who were ensconced, these Milesian Atenists, Hyksos, Israelite, whatever you want to call them, the Judaics, the Tutors, there's a million names for them. These Egyptian Atenists, by the time that they had arrived in Ireland, they were working on the destruction of the Druidic order, the destruction of that old megalithic way, which involves the mysteries of the earth and the mysteries of all sorts of things, and the cannibalization of their knowledge and their gnosis, was going slowly, I believe. I think they even had a lot of problems. So they called on their brothers in Rome to come and help as a mercenary action. They've done this multiple times. It's not the first time. In fact, the whole Alexander the Great thing, conquering, going back to Egypt out of Greece, is actually a tentacle of what I'm also talking about. These are not as they are portrayed in history, as we talked about earlier. They are different than the established reading of history. These were actually mercenary actions funded by this Atenist cabal that I write about. More specifically, the Roman, what we call in history, the Roman army coming to conquer, the Britain and the Gauls of France, Julius Caesar and all these sadists coming out there. These were merely lackeys of the Atenist pharaonic guys who ruled over these people. History makes it look like these psychopaths did it of their own free will to empire build. No, not true. So the destruction of the Druidic culture begins about 500, BC, and continues for approximately 1,000 years, which then brings us up to the creation of what I would consider the cannibalized, corrupted form of Druidism, which is, to be blunt about it, Judeo-Christianity.
And along the way, which is I think an important note, that the great library in Alexandria was burned, slashed and burned, so all the knowledge from the past was lost there as well, right?
That's right.
And that was as a result of the Roman Empire.
Remember the mercenaries?
Yep.
These mercenaries were told where to go, what to do.
Right.
No different than when they accept, don't they, that Henry VIII literally sent, sent out the dissolution of the monastery. They can accept that because it's recent history. But when you say that in Caesar's time or Alexander's time it was deliberate, you're crazy. So
it was deliberate, and so now we have stamped out the vestiges of the Druidic and the highly civilized cultures of that time.
Absolutely. And then you're left with basically a complete monstrosity, a travesty, And
there's a huge component to this, and this is what I want to get into with you now, and that is that the feminine in essence is stamped out in terms of the wisdom and power of the feminine, the goddess, and so forth. Is gone by this point, right?
Yeah.
And then we look now what we have as a society, and I think we can certainly see the effects of having removed the feminine aspect of the wisdom and the triad from the equation. You get what you have now, and all of these essentially the concepts are almost purely masculine. What we're looking at today,
hierarchical, masculine, patristic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So here we are. We've kind of followed this train of thought a little bit, and to see the rest of it, I highly recommend everybody read these books. I mean, I think it's important to string it all together, but we don't have time to string the whole thing together. Let's say here we are now. We're seeing the effects of it. We've seen that society has been ravaged, and we're turning into automatons under this. What do you see is reemerging, and what is it going to take, and how important is the feminine essence in terms of being injected back into all of this to recover ourselves?
Well, I'm glad that you used the term feminine rather than the word female.
Yes.
Because what we're talking about here is expressions of thought, not gender. And of course, the Druidic concept was entirely matriarchal. That has to be understood. In fact, right up even through the Scythian era, it was the same, And one of the other functions of the Druids, by the way, they were called the servants or keepers of truth. The secondary function, of the Druids was the healing of the earth in a very profound way. And so when we think of Druids, we see the Stonehenge portals, which looks like the doorway, the gateway. We see the megaliths aligned to the constellations. This is because the Druids were very, very conscious that their goddess, their Eri, Hera, whatever you want to call her, Demeter, their goddess was damaged. They didn't think of the earth today as we do as some thing out there, that could be controlled and probed and raped and looted. They saw it as a living entity that had been scarred by these cataclysms that they understood had taken place. And therefore, the mound building had many functions. It was to help to galvanize the community. It was also, like you see in Egypt, with some of the very tall towers and even the pyramid itself, so that if it was ever to happen again, documents and icons and relics could be saved. you know, because the doors are above the water
Yes.
line. So there's practical aspects, there was ritual aspects, there was social aspects, the picking up of very small rocks to bring them, like at Maeve's Cairn in Ireland and Carrowkeel and so many of these others, and people marvel at how it was done. That galvanized the community ritually. And in those days, you'll often see the concept of the Egyptian pillar that's lying flat, and then they erect it. You know, it's called the Jed pillar.
Yes.
That was, again, a ritual that was very ceremonial. It was done very precisely at certain times of the year, and the ceremony was about re-erecting that which had fallen. The pole had shifted, there was a chaos, there was a cataclysm, and the raising of the pillar, or the obelisk, was the sign that order is restored again. You know, the Masons and all these people have co-opted all this, of course, for their own purposes. But the fundamental principle was that Mother Earth has been damaged, right? And because Mother Earth has been damaged, the psyche of man has been damaged. So then you might also say then that the third function of the teacher, the elder, the Arya, is to deal with man's fragmented consciousness. There's a relationship between consciousness and matter, you see. So anyone today, just like a medic or a paramedic will deal with the victim of a car wreck, the Druids were people who not only realized that they now have an incredible responsibility to not only heal the earth geomantically, but take on this fragmented creature who's completely out of his tree. Like we said, consciousness has been shattered into multiple parts, you know. And in my work, I've established that the ego, that which we know as the ego, is basically the ghost that arose from the grave of the self. These subsequent traumas that we talked about have so fragmented man's mind in recent times that what was left of that circuit board that still had a little beeping action, I describe it as the doorman in the great corporation. There he is in his office, you know, in his blue suit with his torch, you know, groveling around in the dark at the bottom of the corporation.
Right.
He's very officious, you know. He thinks of himself as the owner, but we need him too, kind of thing. He's keeping the lights on. He's cleaning the floors and making sure everything's working. That's the ego. That is basically the ghost that arose from the grave of the self. So the Druids, or any teacher, update this, fast forward again to any great master or person who's working with these traditions or trying to heal. Mandalas, for instance, all forms of Jungian analysis, all of this is doing the same thing. The idea being that consciousness was fragmented, and we are fragmented beings. Come back to the essence of your question, though. Because of the fragmentation, i.e. the trauma, we have now a problem between two paradigms that can be expressed in many, many ways. Yin, yang, prolific, devouring, nagual, tonal, and the best way I like to explain it is hierarchical and holarchic, or hierarchic and holarchic. And that's why I think the pyramid turns up in so many corporations and on the dollar bill, because that's the perfect symbol for hierarchy, meaning this aggressive, masculine, phallic, ultimately psychopathic type of concept. It is the traumatized, sociopathic, demented, psychopathic mind that perceives hierarchy. It cannot see hierarchy even if you point it out to it. Right? Like we said earlier, it's a Twilight Zone situation.
It's a program.
It's a program. It keeps running. The person who's not part of that, who's omnidirectional, who's understanding that he's a part of the world, not apart from it, right? Who understands that there is a perfect order from the biggest neutron star down to the subatomic level, who understands the miracle of the body, no less. You don't have to look further than your body for the miracle of that, the miracle of birth, the miracle of the eye, the cells, as Bruce Lipton has shown. Incredible people have worked on this concept. What is all of this? This is the idea that you do not need to put earrings on the Mona Lisa. You do not need to perfect what is perfect. You do not need to fix what isn't broken.
Right.
But unfortunately, that is a sane way of thinking, and you have the unsane person who will never, ever in a million years, it's a feedback loop. They can't see it, they will not see it. They don't want to see it. And this kind of psychopathic creature, through these fraternities that exist today, do end up at the top of the power pyramid. The Masonic orders screen out the good men. It's the reverse, it's the inverse of what the Druids used to do. The scum rises to the top.
Right.
And because these people are possessed...
The more corrupt and controllable.
Yeah. And because these individuals are collectivists, and I mean this in the full Ayn Rand sense, they are collectivists. They have no individual identity. They don't want one. Except on a superficial level to give you the idea that they're all wonderful individuals.
Right.
They're not. They are extremely insecure people who have a hive mentality. The architecture of the hierarchy works for them. Going back full circle to the beginning of what we start talking about, it's an architecture of control, but not power. They have control, but they don't have power. Actually, we have the power. Until we wake up, we're not going to realize this. The holarchic model is a feminine model. It is a yin model. It doesn't exclude the masculine principles, but it brings it into balance. It merges with it. And we are seeing this now. It's more receptive. It's more grassroots. And it will not use hierarchical models to fix hierarchy. You know, you're not using the same concepts. You're not coming at it quite the same way. And you're also yourself not infected with this mental virus that came about or is an extension of this fundamental trauma that happened in ancient times.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's holistic in nature.
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. This is holistic in nature. And do you see now that even in the quantum science, if you look back 30 years, you start to see how something's happening where these paradigms are being reintroduced?
Yes, very much so. And the ancient arts that, as you say, were considered part of the original healing arts.
Even
such as feng shui and others.
Exactly,
yes.
And as reprehensible as it was in its own way, this dabbling in the 60s,
mm-hmm.
The guru thing, looking east,
mm-hmm.
Let's not look at all the, the pitfalls of it. Let's look at it broadly. That, again, is a search.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one could say even the rise of psychology, the rise of the countercultural movement.
Trying to understand that division and pain.
Yeah. I've always remarked in my world, the rise of rock and roll, and certain of the paradigms of certain bands and certain music is, again, a seeking to find that wholeness.
Yes.
Again, people fall into pitfalls, they may get distracted. Again, a lot of this is co-opted, again, because the Big Brother is very sensitive to where humanity is going, and it watches and watches, and it puts in its infiltrators to corrupt a certain thing.
Right in the middle of the rock and roll industry.
Yeah, exactly. It's country and western, all of that,
yeah.
We know that. We're onto this. But in the movies, in the
mm-hmm.
films. So to answer your question is, if we start using those, let's say holarchic models in film, in radio, in communication, if we start using the feminine model again in our writing, there's many ways that this can be approached. This will be a hearkening back to the root of what went wrong, to try and heal up the trauma. But again, I'm not saying there's only one way. I'm open to all possibilities. There's lots of different possibilities to bring about that healing.
And in fact, you're optimistic. Some people would hear your work and say, oh my gosh, if I weren't scared before, I am now, because now I see the problem. But in reality, you are an optimist, and you're seeing the opportunity in cultures such as the American culture that is certainly number one in line for being a victim, I don't like the word victim, but a victim of the architects of control, perhaps above all else, because of what does come out of this region of the world.
Yeah.
What do you see as the possibility within that as well?
Well, I'd like to address that very briefly. Being from Europe and all, I keep hearing, they're Americanized this, they've Americanized that, and I always stop people and go, no. This is not coming out of America. America is the first victim of the corporatization of the world.
Yes.
We're talking Blade
Truly.
Runner here, right?
Yeah.
This is a worldwide global corporate structure that is an infection that America has just fallen first.
Well,
So
we obviously must have been a desirable market to take,
Absolutely.
and also a vulnerable market to take.
Yeah.
But how do you look at that?
Oh, I couldn't agree more, and this comes out in my article on the Constitution Con about how the Federalists from day one were absolutely making sure that they'd subvert the Articles of Confederation and some of the other ideas, that would have brought the states together and have a little bit more egalitarian system here, that was subverted from day one, even by those people that are still considered and taught in school as founding fathers. There's an incredible story there. Because the Tsar of Russia was watching, South America was watching, a lot of eyes, people despised the royal system that, was coming out of Britain and the old world. And unfortunately that crept in again later with the federal orgs that we know now still run out of the District of Columbia, the whole federal system. They're back.
Right.
America is nothing more than a satellite of London. The Americans, federal
but yet there's
system.
something else. There is something about America that makes it very desirable to take down
Yes,
and
of course it
control.
does.
Because if you think about it, you've got supposedly all the loose nuts rolled, west.
Yeah.
Right? They say that within America, even the loose nuts, the
Yeah.
fruit and nuts all rolled to California, even. But where you're talking about fruit and nuts, you're talking about a very high degree of creativity as well.
That's right.
You're talking about people who are rogues, free agents, at least in the origins, right? So what happens when you have all these free agents that have run away from the other structures, and now you control them?
I think Buckminster Fuller addressed it when he said, before you can replace an outmoded, corrupt system, you have to create something to replace it. I would subdivide that and say, if you see something rotten dying, let it die. So before you can create something new, if there's something unjust, if there's something rotten and corrupt, and it's fading away, let it. Let it.
I agree.
A lot of the countercultural people want to hustle and too quickly. What are you doing? You're trying to establish your citadels of freedom, truth, and justice over the ruins of what was? Can you just wait till those get washed away first? Otherwise, the pestilence, the rot might creep in.
Right.
So they're coming from a good point of view. They're coming from a good understanding. They're coming from a very optimistic and passionate place. But they're negating a very simple principle of nature. There is a thing called the winter cycle. There is a time when you leave a field fallow.
Where are we right now?
At that place. At that place. We're in the catabolic cycle.
Yes.
We're in the Shivaic cycle. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. Any holistic doctor knows you're going to have to go through that purging period before the immunity rises.
All the cells in the body are constantly going through
Exactly. So it's no different in society. We're all cells of the body politic. We're all cells of the social hive, if you want to call it that. The great ideas will come from individual minds. I'm not saying that. But in a social setting, it's okay. The Maya saw 4 whole civilizations come and go.
Right.
Let's get real with this. It happens. And it's okay. In my book, I'm a very catabolic. I'm okay with deconstruction. Always have been. This is why people think my work is dark and pessimistic, and that's fine. They can think what they want. But it's a misreading of my work.
Right.
It's because they have, again, not understood that there is this holistic cycle, and it includes a purgation. Look at alchemy. There's the incineration, the purgation, the calcinatio, right? Phase before you can have the rejuvenation.
Deconstruction of letting go of the structures that existed before, and we're now entering the winter. What do you see as the opportunity there?
Well, I don't myself, to tell you the honest truth, limit the possibilities by even thinking about them. I know that sounds crazy, right? At that point, it's like Mr. Spock. Everything is possible, and there's all possibilities. And don't even violate that field of possibility by too much contemplation. At least I don't. Because I like to keep the field as open as possible.
So it's a fresh canvas, really, for our creation, for what we can recover of ourselves, what we can remember, we can create again.
Yeah.
And you feel that we're going to do that? How do you feel this race of consciousness is going?
A great deal of civilization is recreation. It's not really creation, it's recreation. It's putting things together in a different way. What happens is when the old structures fall, there is a very insecure time for people, because they've grown so accustomed to that through the conditioning we've talked about and through just their simple own negation of self. And because the self-murdered person is a slave. He's already a person who's going to yield himself to these forms of tyranny. And in fact, he might even be psychically bringing that about. 9 times out of 10 in the alternative research, quote-unquote, conspiracy movement, most people are saying, what are those guys doing to us? What are these guys, up there on the other side of the hill, planning for us? What have they got in store for us? In my thinking, it's about what have we done to create them?
Yes.
What's happening in the psyche, that we have brought that into being, not the other way around.
Indeed, I think that is the appropriate question. And even beyond that, look at how much power we're giving to the architects of control. Certainly there has to be, that's not the final word universally and interdimensionally. There has to be something beyond that by way of a much higher collective consciousness that's occurring, maybe even cosmic collective consciousness. How do you perceive that?
From, again, what I've learned from the Druidic culture, why this is all happening is simply for man to be perpetually okay with deconstruction. That's his lesson. You don't have to go into hypotheticals. The very fact that he now needs to re-understand the Shiva Shakti, Eros, Thanatos concept. He's lost this. He's become acquisitive. He's become yang. He's become aggressive. Partly because, as I said, the people at the top are themselves like that. You see, the people who are this pathogenous force, who are this possessed or obsessed or psychopathic or sadistic or whatever, they don't like an organized world. They talk a lot about order, but actually they live in internal disorder, right? And they are deeply fragmented and traumatized individuals. Therefore, they don't like order. They don't like beauty.
Natural order, natural
order.
cycles and order.
It goes back to this feminine principle that you're talking about. There's flowing, mutable. Remember the Hopi prophecy about letting go of the oars, letting go of the banks, go with the flow? That is lethal to those guys. So that's why they're into New World Orders and global villages and surveillance societies and RFID chips and keeping you in line and where's your all of this stuff and one leash for one neck.
Yeah.
Their global village, their pipe dream is this masculine place in which everybody is walking around like the movie Equilibrium, you know, or various movies have beautifully, beautifully portrayed this robotic creature. Going back even much further, movies have shown this. Because they cannot tolerate that level of spontaneity.
Yes.
You see? So the
because you can't control it.
Yeah, and also they are lethally, they're solar, remember, go back to Akhenaten, they're solar worshippers. They don't like the quote-unquote darkness, which in psychological terms, again, means sleep, quiet, silence, mutability, right? The endless possibility of exploration, looking deeply into something. They want the super lit, fluorescent lit world, and they're getting it. They've built it.
But the collective consciousness is waking up to that other side and doing this deep exploration. Whether they like it or not, it's happening.
Yeah.
I see it, you see it. We are obviously in positions to see this every day just by the input that comes from around the world into these websites, for example. What do you think is going to happen in this race for consciousness, control versus natural order?
It will be, you know, the forces of, Blake said it in his poetry, Tennyson said it, others have said it, you know, the forces of light and darkness are a braid. They're twined together. They're two sides of one coin. So it's about how you balance all of these facets. So man is growing up. The good side is this ancient trauma is being healed. The next step to that is that he then grows up. He learns how to balance the feminine. I actually talked about this a lot in one of the DVDs I did on the divination and the goddess, where what is man's real function if it's not technology? You know, we explored this concept. Basically, the human race has some evolving to do. Remember, trauma, as you said, freezes the memory.
Yep.
It creates an amnesia about the past. It creates uncertainty towards the future. As the healing, you know, happens, you're a bit more coherent, even from a historical point of view, and you're less anxious about the future.
And that's beginning.
Right. Bo Gritz also used to say, Colonel James Bo Gritz used to say that when you heal one thing, the mega thing, lots of other things automatically heal by themselves. You know, and I definitely believe that. He and I may disagree about what is the main thing to be healed, but the metaphor is absolutely brilliant. That once you get back to the fundamentals, you don't really have to go around and micromanage all the other stuff. It will automatically blossom, you know, in its own way.
Are you seeing that blossoming occurring now?
Yeah, no, what's occurring now is the culling and the pruning.
Okay.
Right, the removal of the dead weight. It's Shiva now.
Yeah.
Shiva's in town.
Yeah.
And of course that will be threatening for a lot of people. But you know, what can I do about it? You can't stop the winter.
Right.
You know the old story of King Canute sitting in front of the ocean trying to stop the waves.
Yeah.
You know, if people want to do that, it'll make good comedy. Go ahead.
Yeah.
But I'd rather you spent the time getting with this principle of deconstruction, because it's going to happen. It's happening in your life. It's happening at work. It's happening in your relationships. It is unavoidable. So you either get with it, or you fight against it and potentially drown in the river. You know, because that flow is going on. That to me is the essence of all yoga: is balance. You know, it's the nagwal and the tonal, the prolific and the devouring. It is this whole mergence, so that the extremes come together. Maybe it even will be. See, remember, hierarchy is not altogether bad. In certain areas of life, you require the hierarchy. You know, especially if you're trying to establish something. But the hierarchies of the world brotherhood have become only that, and you can see that in their degree ceremonies and the fraternity structure that they have. It becomes completely sort of accentuated or you know, overly done. You know. So and the holarchy, you know, might also have aspects that are not so hot. You know, so again we have to look at that. But the ultimate thing is that we've swung so much to one side. You know, that potentially now we have the chance to get back into balance. I think that's what's happening. Man has had that chance many times. If he resists it perpetually, then the forces of nature come in to do it for you. So that's why there's a little bit more of a, you know, heat. There's a little bit more of a.
There's an urgency.
Like an urgency. I
yes.
agree. That's the way to put it. There's a bit more urgency, and that's fine by me. That can happen in any modality of life. Sometimes you need that, you know, sergeant major.
Yeah.
To get you all into line, get you up, and you know.
Yeah.
Into uniform, so to speak. So I have not a problem with that, because I come from that tradition.
Yes.
You know what I mean? But I do understand where other people maybe have a problem with that. Secondary to that, and extremely important though, is the continuing process of simple education. Because they want you to be a media-drenched creature, you know. They want you to be a soundbite person. They don't want you to have a beginning, middle, and end to this, or a historical perspective.
And you get into this hugely in Architects of Control, the DVD.
Yeah, very big time. Yeah, and the whole idea of the editing, you know, and the fragmentation that takes place.
Yes.
So what we do is we're very aware of the choir that knows a bit about this, and the newcomers who maybe don't, and the continuing process of education, because you cannot have transformation until you first have the education. And that's twofold. Must know about the problem, must define the problem correctly, in the same way that a holistic doctor has to define what is wrong with you. There's no point, looking at the eyes when the problem's in the heart or whatever, So find out where the real problems are, diagnose it correctly, and then apply the right salve, So this is what's going on. And again, it's not one thread. Not one person has the answer. There's people who want to territorialize this kind of knowledge now, especially fundamental types who think that, that they own it or something. They own this knowledge. They can't understand that there's many tents on the...
It's organic. It's springing up from every source.
Exactly. And I describe it often as having many, encampments or tents on the field of battle.
Yes.
And we all have our banners. We all respect that. But we don't need to be fighting amongst ourselves when we've got a common enemy. And I have really very little tolerance for people who, come into this alternative movement who come in with that bigotry. Because there's no place here. And in fact, you might even be part of the problem at that point, you see. And in fact, you might be put there. There's a lot of these individuals are, financed to precisely act as agent provocateurs and fifth columnists to destroy any kind of flow, you see.
Lots of that.
So we have questions about that as well. But ultimately, as I said earlier on, evil contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. So its ending will be a very magical thing. You don't take it on by using the tools and weapons it provides. And that includes politics. In order to destroy Big Brother or this Orwellian creature, probably wouldn't want to try, doing that with the weapons it's created for you to do it.
What do we do it with?
Well, you do it by strengthening your knowledge, immunity, and in that sense, intellectual immunity, moral immunity, spiritual immunity, of course, all of the above, if possible, so that you are so strong that no matter what they do, they can't defeat you. At that point, you've won. It's a principle I've learned from Bruce Lee, from Krishnamurti, from studying martial arts, from holistic therapy. When you are so strong that your enemy cannot destroy you, you have won. It's Jeet Kune Do, it's Aikido.
That was also part of the ancient Druidic civilization.
Precisely, it was. It was an absolute key part of that,
Yes.
Yeah.
So, in summary, what do you see? I mean, I don't want you to have to, go do a psychic journey into the future. But what do you see? The people say we're in a race against the clock, so to speak, to wake up versus to be in a hypnagogic state where we can be completely controlled. What do you see?
Well, I see that again. It'll be a dance. As the awakening process continues, the injectors of the lie are going to amp that up and step that up, and it will be a race to the finish. What I do see is that and this is basically the raison d'etre of my work, if you keep leaving consciousness at the door, and I mean those who think they're doing some positive work here, if you perpetually keep leaving consciousness at the door, then I would have some problems with the future. And this is unfortunately being done. As I said, the ultimate war is a war on the psyche. Co-opting the trauma, adding more, co-opting the fact that man is disabled, infirm, fragmented, psychotic, right? Sadistic, self-sadistic, needing approval, all of the above. If you have this kind of fragmented, weak, infirm mind, and this war is targeted on this, and this includes the vaccinations, and the addictive substances, and the psychotropics, all of it, the mind control in the media, you name it. It's a war on consciousness. If the movement towards truth, freedom, and justice can take that on board and get back to this understanding of don't leave consciousness at the door, understand that it's a war on consciousness, then I think there'll be some positive, evolution in this journey.
In the end, you're an optimist.
I am an optimist, yeah. Absolutely. As they say, you can be a pessimist about tomorrow, but you can be an optimist about the day after tomorrow.
Perfectly put. Michael, thank you so much for your time.
I've
waited 3 years to get together with you in the flesh, and it's been a total delight. You have a lovely energy.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
For a much deeper look into the Irish origins of civilization, you can go to Michael's website at michaeltsarion.com. Until next time, thanks for watching CMN.